This week, we're going to talk about moral knowledge and another variant of the moral argument based upon moral knowledge. Before we get going, at this point, it's important to pause and review the ground that we have covered. In terms of the content of moral arguments for God's existence, we have made mention now of several possibilities. Some arguments focus on moral facts like objective moral values or duties, and we could have talked about other moral facts like regrets or moral freedom, or even the category of evil. Yet other arguments focus on moral knowledge and others on Kantian moral faith, rooted in Kant's two arguments we saw earlier in the term. We have talked about values, we have talked about duties. Again, recall that pertains to the good and the right. So this week we're going to move on and we're going to discuss moral knowledge. And then next week, our last week, we'll talk about Kantian moral faith. And in this way, you'll be able to see the approach that Jerry Walls and I take on the moral argument. We offer a fourfold moral argument pertaining to one, moral facts, which we've already discussed, moral knowledge, which we're about to discuss, and then those two aspects of Kantian moral faith, moral rationality and moral transformation, that we'll talk about next week. So again, 3 and 4 together make up the two parts of Kantian moral faith. Moral rationality is connected to Kant's argument from providence, and moral transformation is connected to Kant's argument from grace. For now, epistemic moral arguments. There is an impressive and growing body of literature on epistemic moral arguments for God's existence. Among the many who have done work in this area are Angus Angus Ritchie, Richard Swinburne, Mark Linville, Scott Smith, and more. The challenge here in a nutshell: suppose there is objective moral truth, whether or not God exists. The existence of truth is one thing, but our coming to possess knowledge of such truth is quite another. So the question that emerges: how is it that our epistemic faculties have come to be able to track moral truth? What accounts for the coincidence between moral truth and our moral faculties? You see, if our cognitive faculties are simply the product of blind naturalistic causes selected for survival value and not truth, this makes it improbable that moral beliefs are reliable, even if moral values exist. They would be causally unconnected abstract objects outside of time and space, and be causally inert or effete, having no influence on us. It would seem monumentally unlikely and extraordinary that creatures like us would emerge who would have access to this moral realm, including morally binding duties and prohibitions. On a theistic picture, however, it's a little different. God is plausibly thought to have crafted our cognitive faculties so that we can access moral truths and develop moral knowledge. Notice that this is not the idea that theists have moral knowledge and atheists do not. Either we all potentially or plausibly have moral knowledge, or we don't. The question is which of the two perspectives, theism or atheism, provides the better account of reliable moral faculties that put us in touch with actual moral realities. Nowadays, epistemic moral arguments are usually given within the framework of what's called evolutionary debunking arguments against moral realism, or moral knowledge, due to philosopher Sharon Street and others. A brief bit of background is in order here. In his 1993 book, Warrant and Proper Function, Plantinga presented an evolutionary argument against naturalism. In essence, Plantinga's argument was that unguided natural selection, because it favors adaptive behavior rather than true beliefs, presents an epistemic problem for naturalists. Namely, when unguided evolution is combined with naturalism, it provides an undefeated defeater for belief in naturalism. Plantinga argues, in fact, that the assumption of naturalism and evolution leads to the conclusion that all of our beliefs are unlikely to be true. In the decades since Plantinga published his argument, a class of arguments has developed that utilizes the same basic premise as Plantinga's, that natural selection selects for adaptive behavior rather than true beliefs, except that these arguments are delimited to moral beliefs. These are referred to in the literature as evolutionary debunking arguments, or EDAs, typically against moral realism, sometimes against moral knowledge. The main proponents of this view are Michael Ruse, Sharon Street, and Richard Joyce. Wielenberg credits Street's article with triggering an explosion of interest in arguments concerned specifically with normative beliefs or with some specific subset thereof. Street's and Joyce's arguments have garnered by far the most attention of any published EDAs, and of the two, Street's is the most discussed, and is usually taken to be an argument against moral realism, sometimes an argument against moral knowledge. Evolutionary debunking arguments against moral realism or moral knowledge come in various forms, but the basic idea is this. Anyone who thinks there are objective moral truths will presumably think that when we make moral judgments, when we judge, for instance, that lying is wrong or that we ought to value people as ends in themselves, we get the moral facts at least approximately right. But on a naturalistic view of the nature and origins of humans, our faculties of moral judgment are the result of natural selection, a process that selects traits for their conduciveness to survival and reproduction, and is insensitive to whatever objective moral facts there may be. It would therefore seem to be a fortuitous coincidence if our faculties of moral judgment typically got the moral facts even approximately right. Since we should avoid believing in cosmic coincidences of this kind, we should therefore reject moral realism, or at least moral knowledge. Angus Ritchie, in his From Morality to Metaphysics, argues that secular ethical theories confronting this challenge tend to give pride of place either to the pull of objectivism or to the pull of reductionism. The reductionist options escape the debunking objections by watering down the categories of morality. The secular efforts to do justice to the pull of moral objectivism, however, fall prey to what Ritchie calls the explanatory gap. How do we explain the reliability of our epistemic moral faculties, especially if someone assumes a naturalistic and evolutionary picture? This is, once more, the evolutionary debunking objection specifically lodged against naturalism. Here's how you might want to put the evolutionary debunking challenge into discursive format. Premise 1. This is the empirical premise. Darwinian forces have had a pervasive influence on our moral beliefs. Premise 2. And this is the epistemic premise. If 1, that first premise, then our moral beliefs have greatly diminished status or are completely debunked. Therefore, our moral beliefs have greatly diminished epistemic status or are completely debunked. Is someone like Angus Ritchie correct? Is it worse for atheists? Well, arguably, the challenge posed by such evolutionary debunking objections is less of a threat to moral realists who also accept theism. If our faculties of moral judgment were designed by God to be a reliable guide to the moral dimensions of reality, as most theists suppose, and for principled reasons, then the correspondence between our moral judgments and the moral facts would not be an incredible coincidence after all. This is one of several junctures where an appeal to teleology is highly helpful. How do human beings, developing in a physical universe which is not itself shaped by any purposive force, come to have the capacity to apprehend objective moral norms? This quest for explanation is a significant challenge for our secular friends, but I suspect it is a challenge that we as theists are able to answer with effectiveness, because we don't believe in a physical universe that's not shaped by any purposive force, but rather one that is. Theism provides a purposive account of the universe, which arguably can close the explanatory gap. If epistemic debunking arguments work, then either moral realism is undermined or moral knowledge is undermined, or both. If moral realism is undermined, this undermines moral arguments that are based upon it. If moral knowledge alone is undermined, the foundation is lost for any epistemic variant of the moral argument. In the passage we are about to consider, debunking is seen as a challenge to moral realism, but it could just as easily be couched in terms of a challenge to moral knowledge. Brian Cutter analyzes the situation like this. The evolutionary debunking argument is, in effect, an argument from naturalistic assumptions to the conclusion, roughly, that moral realism is false. There are then three possible responses. 1, we can reject the naturalistic assumptions. 2, we can find a flaw in the argument, thereby showing that naturalism need not lead to the rejection of moral realism. 3, we can accept the conclusion that moral realism is false. I became convinced that 1 and 2 are the only reasonable options. For to accept option 3 is to deny claims such as the following. T. Torturing infants for fun is wrong, and it would still be wrong if we came under the spell of an ideology that approved of torturing infants. Continuing the Cutter quote. Now, to call T plausible would be an understatement. It would be hard to think of a claim more plausible than T, and there are certainly no arguments for naturalism with premises that a reasonable person could find more plausible than T. If the evolutionary debunking argument succeeds, it succeeds as a reductio argument against naturalistic anthropology, not as an argument against moral realism. Taken in this way, I think the evolutionary debunking argument is reasonably strong, so I think it provides good grounds for rejecting its naturalistic assumptions. How, specifically, can theism provide a better explanation of the reliability of our moral cognitive processes, a more direct tracking account between moral facts and our moral faculties? Angus Ritchie argues that theism can offer a deeply teleological account of moral knowledge, based on an intentional explanation of our belief-generating and belief-evaluating capacities that track objective moral truth. Ritchie writes that theists, quote, need not deny that the processes described by evolutionary biology explain the generation of human convictions about ethics and their capacity to reason about these convictions and refine them. All that the theist needs to add to the account given by evolutionary biology is the claim that the world is providentially ordered so that the interaction of the quasi-teleological process of natural selection and of the spandrel-like features it generates yield an outcome which enables human beings to apprehend that which is of objective value. I know some of this material can be a little challenging, but this is a nice overview at least, and you can kind of work some more to make sense of some of the details. But basically, the prospects for a tracking account are hopeful on a theistic story or picture, more hopeful than on an atheistic one. If theism can indeed provide a better explanation of the reliability of our moral cognitive processes, a more direct tracking account, thus closing the explanatory gap, prospects for an effective epistemic moral argument seem bright.